right. Welcome to Freightonomics, where we discuss what's happening in the freight markets as well as the overall economy and bring the two together so everybody in the whole transportation, logistics, space, supply chains all around the world will get a better view and transparency as to what's going on with this crazy world that we're living in. Anthony Smith, lead economist, here joining me.
That is one of the most elegant intros you've had to date, sir.
You know, I'm feeling quite rejuvenated, Anthony Smith.
Good.
We had Thanksgiving break. Got a little bit of time away, even though I don't know if, some I guess for some people, Thanksgiving isn't that refreshing. You got a lot of family coming in, but maybe, with the COVID world, you had a little bit more time to yourself, get your
Some
thoughts
Thanksgiving
together.
Zoom calls.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a thinker, so I kind of like a little reserved
I see what you did there. Thinker, Thanksgiving. I see what you did there.
So we've got quite a show today.
Yep.
We're going to discuss, carrier profitability and really profitability in all of transportation, because it's not as simple of an industry as a lot of people think. I actually, back in my finance days, that's my background, was in finance, was not really keen on the idea of getting into the transportation space. And because I didn't think it was that interesting at the time.
Yeah, and this kind of takes us back to where we first kind of got started with Freightonomics, right? It started off with these lessons, these parts of the transportation industry. So it kind of returned to form from almost a year ago to the day.
Yeah, we're gonna take a little bit of a break from some of the topical stuff, even though we are obviously going to hit on some of the topical things. The virus, the vaccine, logistics space, supply chain transformation, et cetera. Those are all things that we will obviously cover in other podcasts and things like that, especially here in the near future, especially the one about the vaccine logistics. That one fascinates me. There's a lot of debate in the space about how that's going to impact trucking, which is already tight. It's not going to make it looser, but the idea that, to a degree, how much is it going to impact trucking, et cetera. CEO Craig Fuller was on Bloomberg, the TV this morning, talking about it too. But today, the focus will be on carrier profitability. But first up, Anthony, we have some stories.
Let's get it.
Of the day. So this one is interesting in the way that, it comes from, Panama traffic jam affecting ocean shipping. Of course, we would have another bottleneck.
Yeah.
Especially in the maritime sector. The freight boom continues. Coming from overseas into the United States, lots of backlogs at the ports. We've talked about that extensively here. You can't get enough freight into the country. The shippers are still ordering freight into next year. They're not able to get their freight before Christmas, a lot of them. And now we've got one more thing. There's bottlenecks at the Panama Canal. So Panama Canal...
And that's a somewhat major canal.
It's not small.
No.
That and the Suez are really the two big canals. But basically, they're talking about how if you have not booked space in getting through that canal, which is, Maersk said, you have to be on top of it, because they're not getting delayed right now, because they're on top of the ball. They're saying 14 to 21 days ahead of time, you got to book your trip through, but it's bottlenecking a lot of the other carriers that may not have been more prepared. And of course, this will just lead more into what what we're expecting into early 2021, which is all this freight that's going to be piling up.
Yeah.
And ready to move.
So, I mean, that's the big thing. I think that almost kind of sums up transportation throughout the year so far. It's just these backlogs. And I think that's where we kind of started off in April going into May, is just this these buildup of backlogs and this scrambling of what we're going to do, how we're going to get all this stuff through the supply chain. And I think this kind of sums up almost what we've seen throughout the year up until this point.
Yeah, this is a well-written article. Greg Miller, one of my favorites for the American Shipper team down there. We talk a lot. Writes this piece. If you want to get more details on that, check out FreightWaves.com, the American Shipper section. It's right there.
Also, other big thing I forgot to mention, as you all know, we are live streaming right now. If you're watching at what, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So
On
I'm
Wednesday.
actively in LinkedIn and Facebook. So if you want to jump in on get in on any of the conversation, feel free to let your voice be heard. So I'll be watching those comment sections closely.
Yeah, and this next story really kind of, I wanted to bring this one a little bit to the forefront because, obviously we've been talking a lot about capacity, supply chain, bottlenecks, et cetera. Well, the drivers out there, the truckers out there, they're getting they're working to move all this freight.
Yeah.
They have their day-to-day problems as well. It's not just about, not being able to ship your stuff from China and getting it across the ocean, not getting capacity out of Los Angeles. But the drivers have day-to-day issues that get glazed over all the time. And one of those big issues has been parking.
Really?
Truck parking. People don't think about it because a lot of these guys, over-the-road drivers, they're away from their houses, their families, days on end. And how many parking lots do you see right off the interstate?
Not a lot. And I think this kind of takes me back to, I don't know if you remember, one time my cousin was in town visiting. He is a driver, owner, operator.
Mm-hmm.
And he was scrambling me just to find a place like, where can I, I'm trying to like scope out where I can park my rig right now, where I can leave it overnight. And that only makes sense. It's one of those things that you don't think of unless you're in the life or you're in the mix of it all.
Yeah, John Gallagher writes this article really actually bringing a lot of this stuff to the forefront, talking about how there's few new public facilities or spaces being developed, and that the challenges continue in planning, funding, and accommodating truck parking. That's the general sentiment, is that, you need, if in my mind, you've got the FMCSA, obviously with safety in mind for people on the road, keeping them safe. But if you're going to regulate their hours of service and tell them how long they can drive, how long they can be on duty specifically, and electronically hold them accountable, and you're not going to have a way for them to stop along the way, I don't understand how you can have one without the other. Like,
Right.
You really need, and I know I've talked to several DOT heads, specifically down there in Louisiana. They're big concern down there along the I-10 corridor, but identifying some of the areas that they can develop these spaces. And of course, a lot of the revenue streams for governments,
Yeah.
not exactly flowing as much as they did in the past. And they're talking about budget cuts, not budget expansion.
Right.
And truck parking, whereas it doesn't have an apparent immediate, impact on public health and safety, these drivers, if they can't find parking and you want them to pull over on the side of the road, like there's not a lot. That's a safety concern unto itself.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's one of those topics that you mentioned. It's not like one of those things that's shiny, like when you're looking at where money's going, like another area that also gets brought up a lot. It's a big area, but infrastructure. When you're looking at highway and street infrastructure, it's one that kind of gets glossed over, pushed to the wayside, but it's so important. I think it's one of those thankless things. It's like, oh, I don't have a pothole on my way to work, or this highway's together. You just expect these things, but there's not a lot of money that gets pushed into these areas, and so it's a crucial part overall.
Yeah, and they did a survey over asking drivers, did they have trouble finding safe parking? And in 2016, 76% said regularly, one or more times a week. Guess what that number was in 2019?
What was it?
75%. Not a lot of headway there.
Yeah, not at all.
There's obviously a concern there when you've got 3/4 of your base having trouble finding parking. If they can't pull over and rest, they can't get their sleep.
Right.
If they have to constantly, figure out, and again, reserving spots. It's like reserving spots at a campsite.
Yeah.
You can't really do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Especially if you're on limited schedule, limited hours. I think there definitely needs to be a lot more, at least visibility into this issue, my opinion.
Definitely. And there was also, if I'm not mistaken, charging for parking as well, right? A little section on that one.
Yeah, no, they'll, most of the truck stops, which are where drivers traditionally look to pull over, they don't want to pull over in these unattended lots that are sometimes off to the side. That's another issue, is that a lot of these lots are not safe because they're just random gravel roads
Yeah.
or random gravel fields.
Yeah.
And that's why a lot of them carry firearms,
Right.
because it's a safety issue. You know, they're out on the road, and it's especially when you're talking about trying to get more diversity in trucking.
Yeah.
If you want if you want driver recruiting to get better, make it a better job.
Right.
And obviously, carriers, there's a shiny object for the year. Driver recruiting, a big issue. Women in trucking, real women in trucking commented on this. Obviously, you know, they're not going to feel safe. A lot of these guys that have been out on the road for a while doing this job know that it's not for everyone. And,
Yeah.
you know, women have not necessarily been traditionally, not a field that a lot of women try to get into. And this is just one more reason that, yeah, especially for women.
Yeah.
You know, not that they're not fully capable of protecting themselves and whatnot, but it is definitely more of a concern on their priority list. You know, men
Yeah.
are kind of taught to be, you know, like you, super strong football players and ready to go take on the world.
Mm-hmm. It adds a whole nother variable
Yeah.
for sure.
I definitely think that we need a little bit more visibility on that for sure.
Yeah. And you kind of touched on carrier, and I think carriers have been, I don't know, if we're looking at carriers, brokers, and shippers, they've all been impacted, of course, differently throughout the year. I think when you see, okay, this has been a great year for freight, great for who, you have to kind of break it out for who it's been great for. But
Yeah.
carriers have really been doing well.
Yeah, they're doing well. They're doing great, so great, in fact, that UPS is now imposing shipping restrictions on certain companies. This was on the Wall Street Journal. Basically, thanks to the e-commerce surge, UPS has now put shipping restrictions on some large retailers such as Gap and Nike this week. You know, and they interviewed, there's several other larger companies in here, LL Bean, Macy's, Newegg, Hot Topic. Hot Topic's still around. You know, basically saying, you know, there's certain limitations. And again, UPS is mainly a partial shipper. They do have LTL and truckload involvement, obviously, but that basically due to the surge of shipments over the Black Friday, another interesting tidbit, online shopping jumped another 44%.
Yeah.
Thanks to Black Friday.
Yeah.
And we thought that e-commerce, what did it grow? What's it been growing at?
It's been growing on a month-to-month basis, anywhere from 10 to 20 to 30% on a month-to-month basis.
I mean, it's like, and now we jumped another 44%. So over the last week, that's only going to push, you know, more volume into the freight market.
Right.
You know, a lot of the freight that's been moving in the space so far has been getting ready for this, though.
Yeah.
You know, so it is kind of a question of how much more volume are we really looking at? This will be that DC to fulfillment center type freight on the truckload side. Obviously, the parcel side is a different sector. There's only really a handful of those in the world that handle that parcel business. But this is fascinating to me.
I think that also kind of lines up really well with, of course, we have to have Z2 on here shortly at some point in time.
We do.
In the next couple of weeks. But Zach Rogers is always going on about how downstream warehouse capacity is so tight. And I think in the latest LMI they had, there was a record low warehouse capacity number. Of course, we're going to have to get him on here soon to talk about that number. But that only feeds into what's happening with e-commerce right now.
Yeah, and we didn't think it could get much bigger. You know, Zach, we talked to him about this and said, how much is this going to impact peak season?
Yeah.
You know, well, he was pretty much right, though. We saw this little mild jump in tender rejection rates. We jumped up to, you know, you can call it mild, I guess, 26 to 28% over the holiday period. We're still hovering right around that 28% mark for outbound tender rejection rates, the rate at which carriers reject their electronic tenders from the shippers, which before 2020 really didn't happen that often. Not to the extent that we're looking at right now. Over 1 out of every 4 loads getting rejected on average. And, you know, carriers basically have their pick of the freight, which leads me into our final story of the day, which is actually one that I'm familiar with because I wrote it.
Right.
The article, this week's Chart of the Week, which I write every week, basically displaying a data-driven article, 100% sourced out of the data, it doesn't come from like another news source or anything like that. And it's a story that I develop strictly from that. I try to find other context to put with it.
All facts, no feelings.
No feelings whatsoever. But carriers are feeling pretty good this year. The article focused around how they've got their ORs dropped from near 100. For those of you that aren't familiar with operating ratio, it is basically what carriers or transportation providers really live by. You know, if you've watched the rails, if you watch their earnings forecasts, they're all OR driven reports. They're trying to eke out every ounce of operational profitability they can get. Operating revenue, or it's operating expenses divided by operating revenue. So basically, for every $100 that, you know, the carrier sells, hauling freight, they were spending about $100 transporting it. So now, in the last month, I believe the last month that we had this for was actually October. It dropped all the way down to about a 94 OR. So they were now making 6 cents on every dollar operating. Operating expenses do not include things like interest and debt. You know, if you're a leveraged carrier, so if you're not making money on your operation and you can't cover your margins there, you're definitely not going to be paying down your debt. And that's how carriers typically go out of business, is that they buy trucks, they leverage it, they've got debt just like every other company, but they don't necessarily have cash flow to maintain that debt level.
Right. And the margins, historically, there aren't large margins, right?
Right. You know, I always targeted about a 93 OR, but again, it's not as precise as just saying, okay, I'm going to make 7 cents on the dollar for this load. There's all sorts of other factors ingrained in there. And one of the topics one of the highlights of the article was the fact that, wait, it only went down to 94. We just saw them turn down 1 out of every 4 of their loads. This is after accepting over 95% of their freight in 2019. And now you're telling me they went from 100 OR to now making 6 cents on every dollar in the tightest market that we've, you know, arguably seen in recent times since deregulation.
I mean, this is... it's wild. It's wild. And it's just one of those things that's kind of like perfectly aligned, because the other thing that impacts fuel, right?
Yeah. Fuel does have an impact, but they do pass along that cost.
Right.
And fuel has not been very volatile. It's been
really low.
It's been low, and it's actually been a bit of a tailwind for carriers here in the last several months, as that spread between the wholesale price of fuel and the retail price of fuel spreads or expands. Especially when fuel prices are coming down faster.
Right.
They're able to buy off the rack wholesale price, and then they turn around and pass along a lot of that cost, which is based on the retail price, at a higher level.
Right.
It's not a 100% pass through, but they do offset a lot of that. So that helps them kind of help keep their margins where they need to be.
And when we're talking about transportation, of course, we're talking about, you know, freight. We're talking about trucks right now. Operating ratios are completely different world when we're looking at rail, right?
Oh, yes. So the rail industry is, you know, like I said before, they're eking out every cent that they can get from their operation, and they do that with their precision scheduled railroading, which is just a fancy term for saying we're going to try to squeeze more blood out of that rock. And it is, you know, they can't really grow. There's a set infrastructure. They have a set number of engines, and then they can put a bunch of cars behind that engine to pull it across the country. They can invest in more engines and extend those rail car lengths, those train lengths, over a mile in length in a lot of cases. And that's how it doesn't cost them that much more to add a rail car here and there. But what it does do is it slows down the train. So there's a big trade-off between service and cost effectiveness.
And I'm looking at some of the comment sections here, and just kind of circling back to one of the conversations we were having a little bit earlier, was we're talking about parking. And this is a great comment here from James Fry. In the LinkedIn, he says his drivers tell him all that they're closing places for truck parking out on side of truck stops, and you can be ticketed for parking on the side of highways and off ramps, of course. He says TA has reserved spots. And it's been a frustrating process looking for more drivers right now.
Yeah. Why would you want to get into an industry that's basically stacking the deck against you? You know, hey, go out, not see your family, live on the road for a while with limited availability. It's not like people are sitting there waiting on you. And again, this adds to that operational inefficiency. If you have to make a plan to stop an hour before you really need to, especially when you're talking about going over the road out in some of these western regions,
Yeah.
with not a lot of population density, not a safe environment. If you have to stop an hour before you're due, just so you can park, that adds to the cost of what you're dealing. You just lost an hour of operational efficiency.
Yeah.
A lot of shippers, a lot of people that I've talked to that aren't familiar with transportation, including myself back in the day, did not realize how much efficiency really made a difference in transportation. And this is true for every mode of transportation, whether it's a boat or any operation.
Yeah.
Any operation, a boat, a train. The trains are just able to do it a little bit more effectively because they're an oligarchy.
Right.
There's a handful of rail providers, and they're kind of kings of their own domain. They're masters of their own domain.
Yeah.
You've got a limited competition in certain areas, and I think most people know that there's limited capacity available. They just get on that. Long-term contracts stays pretty level, et cetera. But for trucking, there's, I don't know, several 100,000 operators out there at this point. We do have, in this industry, 93% of them have less than 20 trucks, which means that you have that many more competing entities.
Yeah,
it's
the barrier to entry is almost non-existent in comparison.
Exactly. So Knight Swift has, I forget the exact tractor count at this point, 17,000 tractors, the largest for-hire trucking provider in the United States. They don't compete with each other on price.
Right.
They can compete with each other somewhat internally, but that's not going to drive their rate down. They're not going to outbid each other or undercut each other. When you have 93% of the market competing with each other, that's a lot of people that can jump in and say, hey, I'm going to go lower and lower and lower. And that's exactly why these ORs are so low.
Yeah.
A lot of these operators, when they have to take into account, when you're talking about logistics, you cannot make mistakes on the road. Gotcha. You've got your pickup, spend an hour and a half picking up something at a live load situation. That's going to cost, we typically say that it's going to cost around $70 to $100 an hour to operate a Class 8 tractor with a trailer, including driver wages and fuel and all that kind of stuff. So you've just cost yourself $140 and you haven't moved an inch.
That's wild.
And now you get paid based on the mileage you're driving. So you're not getting paid on that time that you're sitting there on that dock. Now you got to get on the road. Okay, now what happens when the weather occurs? That's why we have a meteorologist here, Nick Austin, who does a splendid job of covering that. And now there's a snowstorm going across Donner Pass.
As always.
As usual. And that, again, it's going to set you back. Now you're getting set back 4 to 5 hours because you got to stop, put chains on. Oh, they closed the mountain. Can't get out there. You just lost, what's my math here? $350 just for act of God.
Yeah, and the thing is like these are things that rookie drivers don't know until like they go into it, right? And so it's just like, okay, there's that. You're already kind of hesitant maybe about going into the industry, and then you go into the industry and then you find all of these potential variables that you had no idea was going to be a thing.
Yeah, no, it's not an easy space to operate in. It's certainly not an easy space to make money in. So next up, so say you've got a clear road ahead of you.
Right.
You're driving down the road, and you get to your consignee. Well, did you know that that's a backhaul market? You know what a backhaul market is, right?
So now you can't get out with a load. So now you're...
You do know what a backhaul market is.
I've watched Freightonomics episode 3.
Yeah, so now you're going to spend who knows how long trying to find another load to get under. Oh, but wait, you just ran out of hours. So that load that was available now isn't.
So you are in the red for trying to do your job. And so I can see how some people could be operating like a first-time owner-op, or maybe owner-op's usually a little bit more seasoned, but maybe someone that's new to the industry, and they are just losing money left and right, not knowing how people are really kind of keeping their shirts on. Yeah,
I used to always call the OR the margin of error because there's everything that I just named there: weather, traffic, shipper delay, consignee delay, hours of service, limitations. Any one of those first three things goes off, your fourth one is now triggered as well.
Right.
So all these things have to line up. You can do all the planning you want.
Yeah.
And then one of those things triggers, you're off schedule now, and now you have to rearrange your entire network.
Right.
That is why, that OR that you see only dropped 6 cents.
Gotcha.
Because now we have so much freight moving through the country right now. Yeah, they may be charging more for it, but their networks are not any more efficient.
Gotcha.
It just means that they're sitting less. That one aspect of all of that is going right.
Yeah.
And that's the fact they're sitting less, waiting on the next load.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. And James Fry says, it takes a certain kind of person to be a driver. And I absolutely agree with that. And the thing is like, the drivers are keeping, the country moving. It's really the heartbeat of the country, keeping goods moving throughout the country. And I don't think that, a lot of them get the respect that they deserve for keeping goods moving throughout the country. And so James Fry, exactly right. He says a good dispatcher won't put a driver in that kind of situation. So definitely ties into that teamwork kind of scenario.
Yeah, the parking, all that stuff.
Yeah.
is really hard. So, truck drivers, it's not as easy as just carrying it from point A to point B. I feel you out there for sure. And, for people that aren't familiar with that, if they see that $3 a mile and say, well, you should be making tons of money.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, but you've only just solved one part of the whole equation. Yeah, you're making about 30% more on only roughly 10 to 20% of your freight, though.
Yeah.
So that spot rate that you see that's inflated, they're still carrying 3 out of every 4 of those loads, on average, are still operating at 2019 rates. You've only got a handful of them at best that are on the spot market.
Yeah.
Not every load that gets rejected ends up on the spot market. That just means that it goes down to carrier number 2 or carrier number 3, increasing the rate and service a little bit. But again, it's not as simple as I'm going to charge a ton of money.
Yeah, right.
So there goes my rant.
It's a good conversation. I mean, that's what Freightonomics is, that freight aspects. But I mean,
speaking of econ,
yeah.
What do we got on the macro econ front over the last bit?
Over the last couple of weeks, I think one of the biggest updates, at least on my end, was we haven't had a lot, but that most recent PMI number, that was one of the biggest things for me.
The industrial economy really still sluggish.
It's still sluggish, but so the thing was, last time I was on, I had to make that admittance of when the PMI grew a little bit more than I anticipated, when industrial production grew on a month-to-month basis more than I anticipated. I'm like, hey, this kind of took me by surprise. The most recent week we saw the ISM PMI, it moved down a little bit. So kind of back into my expectations of, okay, there's momentum building, but not quite there just yet. New orders also came down, still very strong in mid-60s level. But the thing that really got me that I think is really important is that employment level. And so what we saw was employment was actually growing and expanding within manufacturing. Now went back into contraction mode. So the employment is always going to be one that I watch closely. And of course, it's going to have that inverse relationship with increase in COVID cases. So we are starting to see that more of a sluggish growth or slowing decline or steady decline for manufacturing once more. Likely going to be some decline, I think, going into the fourth quarter for sure. But still expansion overall. But we are starting to see some of those telltale signs.
Yeah, I guess, good news for freight. We haven't needed it so far. And I can't imagine what would happen if we did have that on top of this.
Yeah, I mean,
maybe more of the same.
Rough for some flatbed operators, but at least there's some potential construction activity going on there if that supply can be met with the adequate demand, or the demand can be met with the adequate supply.
Yeah, but not in 2020. We'll have to wait till next year's movie comes out. Speaking of movies,
yes,
is Gremlins a Christmas movie?
Yes, and is Edward Scissorhands a Christmas movie?
No.
Yes, it is.
No, you're wrong.
Yes,
I mean,
it is.
It's just everything set in Christmas isn't necessarily a Christmas movie.
Edward Scissorhands is a Christmas movie. You heard it.
Nightmare
first,
Before
folks.
Christmas, a Halloween or a Christmas movie?
Christmas.
I don't know. I actually don't have a strong opinion on that one, but
Christmas.
That'll bring us to the close of our show today. I'm just going to disagree with you. Download the FreightWaves TV app on podcast players everywhere. Look up Freightonomics or look up Freightcasts and get every FreightWaves podcast. Great quarter guys, What the Truck. Put that coffee down, drilling deep. And hopefully everybody has a great week.
I like great quarter guys.
Of course you do.
I also like What the Truck.
I like them all.
I like them all too. You know who's a wealth of information? John Kingston.
John Kingston is amazing.
He knows everything.